This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Today is Wednesday, I think it's October 30th, 2019. Well, today I want to talk about New Hampshire Trappers. Friday, November 1st, starts the trapping season here in New Hampshire. There are only about 400 trappers, and trapping has been under attack for decades. I was the fur bearer biologist for the New Hampshire Fishing Game Department beginning in 1978 until I retired in 2007. And during that 3 decades, there certainly were attacks on trapping, and people have various opinions. But it got me to thinking, what is trapping? What have trappers done for New Hampshire? And yesterday I actually did an interview with veteran turkey biologist Ted Walsky, and he was talking about the very first attempt to relocate wild turkeys to New Hampshire back in 1968. And guess what? It was the trappers who enabled that. In 1968 and 1969, between those 2 years, trappers captured 26 live fisher, which were then exchanged for live turkeys from West Virginia. So it was the trappers that enabled the very first attempt at restoring wild turkeys to New Hampshire. And guess what? During my 30-year career with the New Hampshire Fishing Game as the fur bearer biologist, guess what else trappers did? No, here in New Hampshire, they trapped fisher, which we transferred to Connecticut in the early 90s to restore a fisher population or boost the population in Connecticut. And then in the mid-1990s, from 1994 through 96, over a 3-year period, I worked with New Hampshire Trappers each December during the legal trapping season, where New Hampshire Trappers captured live fisher that were sent to Pennsylvania. A total of 175 over a 3-year period came through this house right here in Epsom. I would go around during the day, meet the trappers, and collect the fisher and put them in these plastic tubes about this long, about that big around. And each morning at 3:45 in the morning, I took them to the Manchester airport during the month of December and shipped them off via air freight to Penn State University. So over a 3-year period, over 170 fisher were transferred to Pennsylvania. And guess what? They have a viable population there now. Before that, a few years before that, New Hampshire Trappers actually caught live otter, several, that we also shipped to Pennsylvania to restore population there. In Pennsylvania, these animals were wiped out by unregulated hunting and trapping and loss of habitat and pollution, like it happened all across North America. So the populations were wiped out. It's the New Hampshire Trappers that restored fisher populations and helped restore otter population to Pennsylvania and Connecticut. What else have trappers done? Trapping goes back to before colonial times. It was the trappers that explored New Hampshire and across this whole country. It's the trappers that were the pioneers that really helped settle this country. So trapping goes back for hundreds of years, and you know what? We have more wildlife today than we did back in colonial times. What else have New Hampshire trappers done? Well, in the 2000s, I worked with New Hampshire Trappers to send mink tissue to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for testing for mercury. Now, mercury is it's a nerve agent, basically, and when I got the results, I didn't fully understand what they meant when they shipped me the results, like a few months later. So a good friend of mine at the Department of Environmental Services here in New Hampshire, I sent him the data that I had gotten. I said, well, what does this mean? What do these levels of mercury mean in our mink? He said, well, if you were a person and you had mercury levels that high, you would be very sick. Well, guess what? This helped turn the tide about mercury pollution here in New Hampshire, and the Merrimack Generating Station was required to put in a mercury scrubber to reduce mercury output by 90-something%. So trappers helped convince the powers that be in New Hampshire that we needed to work on reducing mercury levels, which are harmful to everything, not just mink, but to our children and grandchildren. Trappers have helped with tissue samples for coyotes for DNA analysis. I sent some to the University of California into New Brunswick. Trappers back in the 70s and 80s, we were wanting to know more about our fisher and otter and bobcats. So here at New Hampshire Fish and Game, I collected fisher and otter and bobcat carcasses. There was a 2 or 3 years that the bobcat trapping and hunting season was open in the mid-80s. So we were able to examine these carcasses, look at the reproductive success, look at the parasites on some of these animals. So we have long counted on the trappers to provide much needed research tissue and carcasses for better understanding the diseases affecting our fish and wildlife. And what else? Here in the 1990s, the late 1990s, the New Hampshire Trappers cooperated with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for trap testing. For about 3 or 4 years, several New Hampshire trappers were selected to trap beavers using different trapping methods, from cage traps to killer traps and foothold traps. And all these beavers I would pick up and send to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where the carcasses were examined for any damage by the types of traps that were tested. And guess what? We developed with the Fish and Wildlife Service and our New Hampshire trappers what's called best management practices. Which type of trap works best and is the most humane. And you know what? To trap in New Hampshire, before you can get a trapping license, you must take Trapper Ed. Who teaches Trapper Ed but fellow trappers? And each year, the New Hampshire Trappers Association, and we only have about 400 trappers in New Hampshire, and it's a small organization. Each year they hold spring and fall events where they teach these best management practices to their fellow trappers. So what else have we done? Trappers, they also, the last several years, have again worked with the Fish and Game Department. In fact, I was just at the October Trappers meeting here in New Hampshire, and Pat Tate, the current fur bearer biologist, was at the meeting asking the trappers to donate fresh gray fox carcasses to Fish and Game for studies at UNH on diseases affecting our fox and also fisher carcasses. Because what has been found recently as fox numbers and fisher numbers seem to be declining is that we have a new disease, distemper, that is impacting our fisher and foxes. So here again, trappers called in to look at what is causing impacts to our wildlife populations. Trappers have always helped their neighbors. Town road agents, they know the trappers in town. When you've got beavers flooding a road, who comes in to help? Often it's the trappers, and they will pull the debris out of the culverts all summer long and then trap the beaver in the fall when the fur is prime. Unlike when you have nuisance wildlife control operators that trap beaver, the trappers often try to not trap the beavers until the pelts are prime in November and December. But nuisance trapping happens all spring and summer. So why would someone want to stop trapping in the fall so that then the next spring the females would have to be trapped and killed when they have young in the den? It makes no sense to me. So the trappers are helping town road agents and towns and citizens, mostly for free, take care of problems with some of these fur bearers. And we're talking over a dozen species, from weasels to mink and otters and beaver and coyotes and foxes and fisher and opossums. So we have more than a dozen fur bearer species in New Hampshire, and lucky for me, I was able to help set the regulations that govern the trapping and hunting of these fur bearer species for over 3 decades. So yes, we have more of these animals today than since colonial times. The trappers are helping in many ways, helping our fellow citizens, helping our road agents, and doing things, mostly often for free. And you know what? For a trapper to set a trap, he has to have landowner written permission. Trapping only happens where the landowners want it. And guess what? When he gets that signed permission slip from Fish and Game, he then turns a copy over to the local conservation officer, and every trap must have a trap tag of the trapper's name and address. So every licensed trapper has to get landowner permission before he can set a trap, notify Fish and Game where the traps, on whose land the traps are being set. It's a very, very highly regulated sport here in New Hampshire. So trappers have to jump through many more hoops than anybody else. So, you know, trappers, I wish you a lucky and enjoyable fall season.